Hello again, and welcome to my Tome Infinity and Beyond wrap-up. I read 11 of the 14 books on my TBR, which I'm absolutely thrilled about since I got through a typical monthly book number for me in just the 2 weeks of the Readathon. 7 were by new-to-me authors, and 3 were new-to-me books by authors I'd read before. 8 of the books had been on my own TBR shelves, and 1 was a reread. Regarding authors, 5 books were written by a woman, 1 by an author of color, 1 by a queer author, and 2 by a Jewish author. Regarding main characters, 5 books had at least 1 woman, 2 had at least 1 POC, 2 had at least 1 queer character, and none had a Jewish main character. All 11 books were, of course, sci-fi. 1 book was a graphic novel, and I DNF'd 1 book. My ratings were 1 5-star, 3 4-stars, 2 3.5 stars, 1 3-star, 2 2.5 stars, 1 2-star, and 1 1-star. I started my journey on Ship C, whose challenge was to read a book of short stories. For this, I read Murasaki, written by 6 different sci-fi authors and edited by Robert Silverberg. The premise of this book was for these 6 authors to write their own stories set in the Murasaki star system, which is a real system, to create an imagination of what alien life might be like in that system and how humans would go and discover it. There are 2 appendices in this book at the end, one written by Powell Anderson and one by Frederick Pohl, that are very dry imaginings of the types of creatures and the environment that exist on the 2 planets that humans visit in this book. I started reading those appendices, but it was just dry. There was a lot of math for how the planets moved around the sun, and I personally was more interested in getting to actual story. For the first 5.5 stories in this book, they were interesting, but I tend to prefer more character-driven stories, and while there were individual characters in here, it was very much an exploration of the alien creatures, the world, the food, the plants. For my reading purposes, it was a little bit dry. I didn't see any kind of point to any of the stories, and I didn't see a trajectory. However, the last half of the 6th and final story suddenly brought everything together. It was like reading a mystery when you didn't even know going in that it was a mystery. Suddenly, all the pieces from all the other 5.5 stories melded together. That was a really cool effect, and that ended up making me think really highly of this book. I gave it 3.5 stars because there were some definite problematic aspects to some of the stories. The first story contained fat phobia. Most of the stories had to make some kind of commentary on the appearance of every single female character that existed, and I will say there's only 1 female writer of the 6 who participated in this collaborative project, and it shows. I also couldn't go above 3.5 stars because those first 5.5 stories were, for me, something I couldn't connect to. But that big reveal at the ending did make it all worth it, and I thought it was done very well. I'm glad I didn't DNF it, especially with the fat phobia and the odd focus on female appearances that happened in the first story. The first stop on my journey was the planet Venus, whose challenge was to read a book with a bold female character. For this, I read Sassenach by Anne McCaffrey and Elizabeth Moon. This is one of the 3 books in the Planet Pirate series. Some sources say it's the first book, some say it's the second. Based on the timelines within the series, I chose to take it as the first book. This book is about a young girl who lives in a mining colony on a planet in some solar system, and her planet is attacked and ravaged by space pirates. Her entire family is murdered. Most of the people she knows are either murdered or her friends are taken captive for slavery purposes. The book follows her journey as a slave, escaping slavery, and then working her way up through the military that exists in this universe and becoming a captain of a ship whose purpose is to find and eliminate the space pirate industry. I really enjoyed this book. I loved following Sassenach through her life, through her struggles, through her triumphs, and seeing her development and her relationships with characters. The world building was really interesting, and I loved seeing female characters who were sexually free to pursue the relationships that they want without any kind of censorship. The last section, unfortunately, was a bit of a mess. I think it's because the timeline of that last section also coincides with one of the other books in the series, but it was written in a very confusing way with a lot of jumps. The pacing was totally off, so it wasn't able to stand on its own in this book. However, I am really excited to read that second book and then the final book in the series, following Sassenach and following the character that was introduced in that last section and who is the focus of the second book in the series. I gave this book 3.5 stars. The next leg of the journey was to visit the sun, whose challenge was to read a book featuring a solar-based event. For this, I read Nightfall by Isaac Asimov and Robert Silverberg. This book took Asimov's short story Nightfall, which is about a planet with 6 suns who always experiences perpetual light of some sort. And then the planet finds itself facing an eclipse for the first time in 2,500 years. Basically, everyone freaks out about it. What Robert Silverberg added was to flesh out the story with a beginning and an end into a full novel, which is the book that I read. This book was so good. I have never read Asimov before, but the writing was just so tight and on point. Every moment, every scene and character followed from the beginning of the book just led up to that moment of the eclipse. It had kind of a thriller anticipation to it. There were definitely some horror aspects to it, especially after the eclipse happened. The writing was so well done that even though there were a handful of characters to follow, I was invested in them and their studies from the beginning. What I really liked about this book was that it didn't approach the eclipse from just an astronomical angle. It included archaeology, it included psychology, it included media. One of the characters was a newspaper writer. They were separate at the beginning, but then slowly as the book developed and they each individually found evidence for the eclipse about to happen, they come together, slowly merging into that point that is the actual event of the eclipse. I thought it was really realistic how the author portrayed a society who had never known darkness. They did not know that this eclipse was going to happen, and how it affected people, how it destroyed civilization, and not just the darkness, but they thought that the entire universe was within the area of those 6 suns. And then when the eclipse happens, they're able to see the stars for the first time. Oh, and in addition to all the other elements, the psychology, the archaeology, astronomy, and media, there's a religious aspect to it, and how they have to handle the religious calling of this apocalypse that they didn't believe in before, and then they start getting the scientific evidence for it, and how they have to handle the way that the religious people peddle their dogma versus actually trying to warn people based on the scientific evidence. Everything merged perfectly. The tension was fantastic. The ideas were clear and followable and believable and really interesting. I liked being able to see that beforehand and the effects of the eclipse afterward in this post-apocalyptic world that occurs after the eclipse. I highly recommend this book. The next stop on my journey was Mercury, whose challenge was to read a book under 250 pages. For this, I chose Brothers of Earth by C.J. Cherryh. I have heard about C.J. Cherryh a lot as a classic author of sci-fi, and especially since she's a woman who was writing in that time. However, I really dislike this book. I couldn't even finish it. It's a book that I DNF'd. The writing style was really dry and distanced. I couldn't connect to any of the characters or what was going on, but I pushed through, hoping that things would start making sense, the world would start to converge into something that I cared about. But then I got to the point where there was insta-love between the main human character and a very humanoid alien woman, and he showed his love, I'm putting that word into air quotes here, by breaking all of her boundaries. The alien creatures do not like physical touch, and he insists on touching her and not letting her leave the room. There was one sentence that says he literally did something he knew she didn't want. I skipped ahead at that point to see if there's anything salvageable about this book, and I happened to come upon a scene that I won't describe because of spoilers, but you can look at my review on Goodreads and read it if you want to. But it's just one of the worst tropes, misogynistic, horrible treatment of this woman, and I just noped out of this book. I gave it 1 star. After Mercury, my journey took me to the Asteroid Belt, whose challenge was to read a space opera adventure. For this, I picked up a book I had been wanting to reread for a long time. It's another Anne McCaffrey book called The Rowan. It's the first in a series of 5 books. The series is called The Tower and the Hive. I read this series when I was a teenager, and I remember absolutely loving the whole thing. I definitely enjoyed it upon reread, but there were more problematic aspects to it that now that I've matured as a reader over many years that hindered me from enjoying it as much as I did when I was a teenager. A lot of the male characters were very domineering, and they get away with it in this book. But there is a counterbalance with a lot of feminine empowerment, especially in the way that the final conflict of the book is handled. This book takes place within Earth's solar system and some planetary systems in the nearby area. Many humans who have expanded into the universe have varying levels of psychic, telekinetic, other types of paranormal abilities. The way that shipments of cargo and humans get from place to place in space are from the most powerful humans with abilities called primes. They, with their telekinetic abilities, basically port shipments between each other. This book follows one particular prime called the Rowan from her childhood to her adulthood. The first part of this book, following her from the age of 3 to about 18, is great. It's her discovering her powers, where she fits in, the typical coming of age just set in space with telekinetic powers. After that, the book kind of devolved a bit. She's this great powerful character, and there is an overarching conflict that she has to deal with. But at that point, after that first section, it really focuses on this sudden romance aspect. And that relationship with the guy she ends up falling in love with is definitely a little bit problematic. I've certainly read worse. In this book, the insta-love romance, which is the fastest case of insta-love I've ever read, could really be explained because they are telepathic and they can discover each other's emotions and backgrounds in an instant, but I still side-eyed it a little bit. The Rowan character did seem to lose herself a little bit in that relationship, but the book had set her up as a really lonely character. It's the nature of primes to be very lonely, so her discovering someone that she connected with was something that she appreciated quite a bit. So there were pros and cons. Ultimately, it weighed out into a 4-star read, which was probably a half-star rating more than I might have given it had I been reading this for the first time, but I will consider that half-star a nostalgic half-star. I do look forward to continuing the rest of the series to see how they hold up. The next step of my journey was to switch to Ship D, whose challenge was to read a new-to-me author. For this, I chose Asteroid by Walter John Williams. I had no idea what to expect from this book, but I ended up seriously enjoying it. I ended up reading all 450 pages of this book in one day. It was a great, long sci-fi with a healthy dose of adventure thrown in. This book is about a far distant human civilization spread out across the universe. Each section of the universe is ruled by one Aristos or Ariste, the Aristoi at large. Earth has been destroyed by nanotechnology gone wrong, but there has been a second Earth established. The main character that this book follows is the Aristos of a totally different area of the universe. The way that the Aristoi communicate with each other is by plugging into something called the Onerochronon. They mentally plug into it, almost like a mental internet, and they can manipulate the programming within that virtual reality in their heads to create ballrooms or mountain areas or whatever environment they want to be in, and that's how they communicate with with each other. The conflict in this book is when that main character discovers that there's a problem within that virtual reality system, that everything could be compromised, and that some kind of secret experiment is going on a planet system very far away that would be illegal and unaccepted by all the other Asteroids. The book is about figuring out exactly what's going on and how to handle it. The inciting action for that conflict doesn't happen until about page 100, but all the introductions to the characters and the world and the relationship in that first 100 pages is essential to the readers, or at least to my understanding. It took me a good 30 or 40 pages to really understand what was going on and how this world works. From understanding the Oneirochronon, that virtual reality, to the role of these personalities called daimons, which are basically alternate personalities that every person has and can talk to in their heads. It was a really interesting dynamic. I really enjoyed it. It just took a while to get into, but once I did understand, I was invested in this story. Like I said, there was action and adventure. There was philosophical exploration of humanity and integrity, lots of character and relationship development, scientific and technological advances. The culture on these worlds was one of the more realistic, futuristic human cultures I've encountered, because it took lots of pieces from all over the world of Earth as we know it today and melded it into something that seems believable. Lots of secrecy and betrayal, and at one point the main characters are even undercover on a pre-technological world, so we have space and all this technology, but then you have a section where they have to deal with a pre-technological world. So it has everything you can think of. It was packed in. The pacing was great. I really appreciated that the main character was a bisexual, polyamorous male character in a book written 26 years ago, and there was no issue with that from the other characters whatsoever. It was really good, and I enjoyed every minute of that ride. The next step on my journey was Ship B, whose challenge was to read a book set on Mars. For this, I read The Sword of Rhiannon by Leigh Brackett. I was really excited for this book because Leigh Brackett is the female sci-fi author who wrote the first draft of the Empire Strikes Back Star Wars movie. She's a really big name, but I don't hear about her often. This book is about an archaeologist on Mars who gets pulled back in time and has to deal with a lot of the civil strife happening in the world that existed in the past. Unfortunately, I did not like this book very much. I liked the writing quite a bit. It was very tight, easy to follow, and often a lot of the phrasing and descriptions of the world were really beautiful. But I really disliked the main character. I had a lot of trouble believing that the world over 1 million years in the past on Mars was so similar biologically. Other than small variations like skin color, they seem to be exactly the same biologically as humans in the present. The main character was able to integrate into their environment pretty easily, including being able to fluently speak the language. I just thought that was unrealistic. The romance aspect was ridiculous. They hate each other at the beginning. The woman has him enslaved and whipped, and somehow he finds that hot, apparently. She has absolutely no reason to like this guy other than the fact that he's the hero of the story. I am glad that I read the version of this book with the introduction by Nicola Griffith, because she was able to put this book into context of the time it was written. At that time, a lot of westerns were being written. This book definitely feels like a western, with the arrogant hero who gets the woman in the end, who is able to triumph under ridiculous odds. Just this happened to be set in space with time travel. I do not like that dynamic. I gave this 2.5 stars. Next on my journey was Mars, whose challenge was to read a book featuring aliens. For this, I read The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov. It's my second Asimov ever, and for Tome Infinity and Beyond. This book is about Earth discovering a seemingly infinite source of energy by exchanging protons with a parallel universe. Of course, there's a problem with that, but only a couple of people actually know or suspect that there will be catastrophic effects from this exchange of protons in the very near future. This book was good and interesting. I definitely had to suspend my disbelief for most of the hard science aspects of it because the physics went right over my head, but I did enjoy overall the way that it was laid out. However, this book seemed to be way too long. It could easily have been 100 pages shorter. The book was divided into 3 sections, and the entire middle section took place in that parallel universe. That was by far my favorite section of the entire book. I loved the aliens, I loved their world, I loved the characters that were focused on, but I don't think it actually added anything to the overall plot of the gods themselves. I think it would have stood by itself as a short story or novella much better than it did in this entire novel. I will say that the dialogue between characters throughout the entire book was spot on. Asimov is a master of showing versus telling and pulling the reader into the way his worlds work without any exposition whatsoever. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. My journey next took me to Jupiter, whose challenge was to read a book featuring giants. For this, I read Attack on Titan Volume 1. This takes place in a post-apocalyptic Earth in which giant, mostly androgynous creatures have driven humanity behind walls in the last city on Earth, because if humans venture past those walls, the giants will eat them. I have seen season 1 of the anime and I really enjoyed it, so I was excited to get to actually reading this book. The manga did not disappoint. The artwork is wonderful. I love when in manga or graphic novels, the artist knows exactly which frames of action to pick to really draw the reader in and get emotions and plot across perfectly. Even knowing what would happen from watching the anime, I was still caught up in the story and the characters and that overhanging threat to humanity in the tone of the entire book. I got emotional. I thought it was done really well. I can't wait to continue reading the manga. Next on my journey was the comic relief planet Uranus or Uranus. For this, I read The Universe Next Door by Robert Anton Wilson. This is the first in the Schrodinger's Cat trilogy, in which various parallel universes are explored with the same characters and mostly the same plot. Just some details change, and the author explores those changes in the different sections of each book. What I really appreciated was how this book, written in 1979, and this satirization of politics in the United States is still relevant today. It's frightening, disappointing, and also unsurprising. I was able to appreciate the humor that came in there of the satirization of the government. It got to the point where some of the details that the author put in this book were so on point to the issues we're dealing with today. In this book, the government some of the characters work against is ruled by a small amount of rich people who control 99% of the country's wealth. The solution that the group wants is for just one of those rich people to give up all their wealth above 1 million. They would still have an entire $1 million, but by giving up all the rest of their billions and distributing it equally to every other citizen in the United States, it would solve the majority of the problems. We see that same argument and issue today, so it was weird to read a book from so many decades ago that could have been written today. I enjoyed part 1 of this book where the characters were new, the plot was new, the ideas were new. Part 2 follows a parallel universe where mostly everything is the same. It didn't add anything to the point of the book, and it got really, really weird. The whole book is bizarre, but at least in part 1, there were those thought-provoking elements to balance it out. Part 2, to me, lacked cohesion, was difficult to follow, and didn't add anything, so I didn't care. I will not be continuing this series. I gave it 2 stars. The final leg of my journey, and the ultimate place where I will be settling anew after the destruction of Earth, is Saturn, whose challenge was to read a book with circles on the cover. For this, I read Sphere by Michael Crichton. This book follows a psychologist who is called to the scene of a Navy dive in the middle of the ocean where they think they have discovered a spaceship. It's a little bit mystery, a lot thriller, a little bit sci-fi. The beginning was great where you have that mystery aspect. They're trying to figure things out. There's a lot of science to especially being 1,000 feet below the surface of the water. I enjoyed all that. But by about halfway or 2/3 of the way through, the focus shifted so greatly to the thriller aspect and far outweighed the sci-fi focus. I appreciate thriller, but I really wanted to continue that good sci-fi that we had at the beginning of the book. The thriller aspect so superseded the sci-fi that we didn't even get an explanation for the sci-fi at the end of the book. I really also didn't like the way that the author handled issues of race and gender among the cast of characters throughout the book. I gave it 2.5 stars. And that was my journey to find a new settlement for Tome Infinity and beyond. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts on them are. Thanks for joining me.